Good afternoon and greetings from the Nunavik Institute for European Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as director of this institute, which has been established to build bridges between our university and Europe. Bridge building is more important than ever. We are all distressed by the situation in the Middle East, and we also understand that the violence in Israel and Palestine may have an impact on the world's perception of and attention to the war in Ukraine. Nonetheless, the connection to Ukraine is of particular importance to us here at the Nunavik Institute. We have a special bridge built between Notre Dame and Ukraine, particularly the Ukrainian Catholic University, with its president, Archbishop Boris Gutsiak, and its rector, Taras Stopko. Because of joint research projects and conferences, visiting scholars and country visits, Ukraine is a country with a face for us. We are part of the University of Notre Dame's special commitment to Ukraine. In 2019, University President Father John Jenkins went to Lviv to bestow the Notre Dame Award on Archbishop Gutsiak, who was Notre Dame's commencement speaker in 2022. In a statement to the Jewish community of Philadelphia in the United States, Archbishop Gutsiak yesterday expressed his condolences on the occasion of the unconscionable terrorist attack on Israel this past weekend. The statement said, "During our Saturday and Sunday services, we raised prayers for justice and peace for you, your friends, and your relatives. More than ever today, Ukrainians and Jews, people of faith and people of goodwill, can understand each other as we face acts meant to lead to our annihilation. Let us reflect on leadership in violent times." Welcome to our panel, our virtual panel on the Zelensky Effect. Ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky emerged as a leader in a conflict situation with a global presence and influence. In December 2022, Time magazine named the Ukrainian president its Person of the Year. 2 days after the invasion, CNN reported that President Zelensky turned down an offer from the US of evacuation from the capital city, Kiev. In a statement, Zelensky said, "I am here. We are not putting down arms. We will be defending our country because our weapon is truth. And our truth is that this is our land, our country, our children, and we will defend all of this." Zelensky's life has sometimes been described as a journey from comedian to icon of democracy. On the second day of the war, Zelensky stood with his chief of staff, as well as Ukraine's prime minister, next to a Baroque building in the heart of Kiev that all Ukrainians would recognize. Recording on his iPhone, Zelensky sent a defiant message. "We are all here, our soldiers are here, the citizens are here, we defend our independence." Since then, Volodymyr Zelensky has been ubiquitously present in parliaments and national assemblies around the world, either virtually or in person. He has hosted high-ranking political leaders and has been invited to address countless audiences on numerous occasions. In 2022, Olga, Onuch, and Hale co-authored a book with the compelling title, The Zelensky Effect. The book acknowledges the remarkable way Ukraine is defending itself, having also won the battle for Kiev. The book develops the idea that the Zelensky effect is less about the man himself than about the civic nation he embodies. What makes Zelensky most extraordinary in war is his very ordinariness as a Ukrainian. Our panel would like to explore the leadership of President Volodymyr Zelensky, who became president after playing a president on TV. Our panel seeks to discuss the influence of the Ukrainian president on the resistance of Ukraine and the current situation on the ground as the war continues. We do not want to shy away from complexities, including criticism of Volodymyr Zelensky. Notre Dame professor Michael Desch, writing on the tragedy of Volodymyr Zelensky and his failure to end corruption or peacefully settle the Donbas conflict, talked about the messiness of the world and politics as the art of what is possible in this messy world. So what is possible? By many accounts, President Zelensky has achieved what many would have considered impossible. Today's panel has been put together to explore the Zelensky effect. We have 3 wonderful panelists and a first respondent. I will very briefly introduce them in the order of their inputs. Hale is Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the George Washington University and co-author of the book, The Zelensky Effect. He's also co-director of the program on new approaches to research on Eurasia. Welcome, Henry. Thank you so much for being with us. Irina Starovoy is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies at the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. She just traveled back from Vilnius, and we are very grateful, Irina, that you're here with us. Welcome to the panel. Daniel Philpott is Professor of Political Science, a Nanovic Faculty Fellow here at the University of Notre Dame, and an ambassador of the Ukrainian cause here in the United States. Thank you, Dan, for being with us. Olga Onuch, co-author of the Zelensky Effect, has been invited and planned to be on the panel, but sadly had to cancel this morning due to illness. Our first respondent will be Zoriana Rybczynska, head of the Department of Cultural Studies from the Ukrainian Catholic University. She's also a visiting scholar here at the Nanovic Institute this semester. Welcome, Zoriana, and thank you for joining us. Each panelist will offer her or his insights for 5 to 7 minutes. And then we have our first respondent with a brief statement, and then we will have time for your comments and your questions. Please use the chat function or the Google form for this. We will end on time at 1:30 US Eastern Time, since we want to respect people's busy schedules. So again, welcome all, and please, Henry, if I could give the floor to you. Professor Hale, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Clemens. I really appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to be here with such distinguished guests. Unfortunately, on a sad occasion, but I think Zelensky's leadership is something that is really quite remarkable in world context, and it will be, I think, very interesting to explore it more with everybody here today. So you mentioned our book entitled The Zelensky Effect, and it addresses several questions. And so maybe I'll just kind of summarize our main arguments and some of the themes that we talk about, and then I'm happy to address anything else in the question and answer along with the other esteemed panelists. And the book addresses, first of all, why did Ukrainians mobilize so successfully against Russia in 2022, starting in 2022? What was Zelensky's role in all this? Why was it a surprise to so many people? And what might we expect for the future? And our central answer in the book is that this is primarily a story of Ukraine rather than a great leader's story. But at the same, that is about the Ukrainian people and the population itself. But at the same time, we do argue that Zelensky played a key role, and certain elements of his leadership have been very important. And we argue that Ukraine's response and Zelensky's role were both surprising to different sets of people for different reasons that I can talk about just a little bit, but I mostly want to focus on Zelensky himself here. And the Zelensky Effect is, again, the title is Zelensky, but the book is much more about Ukraine. And so what we argue the Zelensky Effect is primarily is that he is a reflection of civic Ukrainian national identity, which is a broad way of defining the Ukrainian nation that's broadly inclusive of different ethnic groups, religious groups, linguistic categories, you have it, and that it's primarily about identification with the country of Ukraine. But at the same time, he amplified this in very important ways, which began during his career in entertainment. And so we see a lot of continuity between his role as an entertainer and actually, we argue it's much more than an entertainer. He was a producer and in many ways a generator of narratives of national unity that continued straight through his presidency and then became very important and happened to resonate very well with the needs once Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022. Of course, we should always remember that the actual invasion began in 2014 when Russia began taking parts of Ukrainian territory and instigating conflict in parts of eastern Ukraine. So I won't go into a lot of the misconceptions, but I will mention them briefly just because I think they help frame some of the discussion. And one is that Ukraine, as it's portrayed in the media, at least prior to 2022, often appeared as a divided society. And we make the point that, yes, Ukraine is ethno-linguistically diverse, and it has a robust political life with different political forces battling each other fiercely, often concentrated in certain parts of the country, but that this isn't that different from what we see in lots of places. The United States right now is also a country that in many ways would appear to be divided in a similar way. It's something that happens in democracies. But one thing that Ukrainians agreed on that you can document very clearly prior to 2022 is that they did not want to be ruled by Moscow. So even forces in southeastern Ukraine who wanted closer ties with Russia and wanted to be part of a Russian-led customs union still did not want to be ruled by the Kremlin. They identified strongly with Ukraine, and this is partly what manifested itself after the full-scale invasion. And so what part of what the book talks about is, and we argue, is that Ukrainians have always had a strong sense of civic national identity, at least since independence, but you can trace it back further than that, but that it strengthened over time and that people mobilized to the cause increasingly over the course of Ukraine's independent history. And so another misperception that was out there was about Zelensky as an inadequate leader. And so, typically when he appeared in the United States media coverage, he was talked about as just as a comedian, how interesting a comedian became president. Many of his political opponents characterized him in that way as well. He was often derided as a Savok, a Soviet person, someone with the Soviet mentality. But in fact, what we try to show in the book is that he was much more to that. First of all, on a personal level, he was more substantive always from the beginning. He studied law and economics in university, had originally planned to become a diplomat before going into entertainment. But even when he went into entertainment, we have to remember this was a highly political job because he wasn't just someone who appeared in roles and read scripts. He was a producer who managed many shows, and he actually was the general producer of Ukraine's biggest television station under Yanukovych, Inter. And so that is a very, very political job, and he discusses the political aspects of this in some of his interviews. And so this is not somebody who was completely new to politics and had no idea until he suddenly got this political awakening. But even more importantly was that we find that throughout his programming, looking at his concerts and his kind of comedy shows that he would hold across the country, as well as his famous Servant of the People television show, there was a really strong message of Ukrainian national unity, which was organized around a European vision for Ukraine, and also a vision in which people took responsibility for themselves. And he was pushing this narrative, and this is something that helped carry him to victory in a landslide in 2019, which was this vision of a united Ukraine that whereby Ukrainians were Ukrainians primarily because of their love of country, loyalty to country and nation, and their common experiences as Ukrainians rather than association with a particular language. And it turns out that these messages were very, very effective when Russia launched its full-scale invasion in 2022, because the mobilization that we saw was just about that. It was about a love of country, a desire not to be ruled by Russia, and these were things that he reflected. So I think maybe I will just end it there since I'm at the end of my 7 minutes, and I'll be happy to elaborate or talk on whatever topics interest you all. But thank you again. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you, Professor Hale, for reminding us of the political nature of Zelensky's engagement in the entertainment industry, for his background, and also for giving us the gist of the book. It's a story of Ukraine and its people. Thank you so much. Irina, if I may give the word to Lviv now. Professor Starvoit, please, the floor is yours.
So in my understanding, the book, the Zelensky Effect book, is in many ways a book about the origins of Ukrainian civic identity. And this civic identity is traced deeper than just February 24, 2022. I would say that the authors think of the generation of independence. And this generation of independence more or less coincide with the generation of Zelensky himself. I mean, people who were too young to vote for Ukrainian independence back in 1991. But at the same time, those who were defined in many ways by the things which came after. And we remember the outcome of the referendum. It was 92% pro-independence. And it was a shocking figure, not only for Ukrainians themselves, but for the rest of the world, and first of all, for Russia. We know that dissolution of the Soviet Union is a very important bifurcation point to which probably in this book authors will be referring not once. But why so? First of all, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union came a period, a formative years for this generation of independence, both in Russia and in Ukraine, which later were dubbed by the name the Bedy 90s or Likhie 90. The Bedy 90s, why? Because the wild capitalism came, because the old ideals fall and no much ethical ground has been resurfacing, reappearing in these circumstances. So basically, it was a very dark and hard time to survive. And people were using all kinds of strategies to survive, very often immoral. It is not only about the oligarchy which has been forming on the upper echelon and which was directly influencing the power or even sometimes representing the power, but it was also dissolved on the middle class and lower class understanding of the wrong and right, of the good and bad, of the good and evil. So in a way, I would say, in these 1990s, some prerequisites for social nihilism were formed in Russian Federation, and it was associated with killing of investigative journalists, poisoning the enemies, the political enemies of the regime, harshing the opposition in all possible ways or buying them. So in that way, Ukraine was only mirroring scenarios and attitudes which were becoming the new normal in the Russian Federation. But in Ukrainian case, something went different. Ukrainians didn't buy that narrative which is forming by the end of the 1990s about the Soviet nostalgia, that everything was better in the Soviet Union. Ukrainians just did not buy that. And because of that, we have two major episodes of social and cultural mobilization. One was later called the Orange Revolution, and the other one is known worldwide as Maidan. So the Orange Revolution was about rigged elections. And the major narrative or the major message which has been formed through the Russian backstage, let's say, into Ukrainian media was that Ukraine is a divided country, that democracy doesn't exist, that actually people don't have anything to say. It's only oligarchs who will decide to whom the power will belong. And Ukrainian citizens were strongly opposing this narrative and this message, and they just flocked to the main square in the capital, in Kyiv, in a very frosty and windy day of November 21, 2004, and they started to defend the transparency of the election. So actually they were talking about democracy as something which is very serious, and they are going to defend their rights to vote and their rights to change the power if they think that the leadership is somehow compromising Ukrainian interests and is abusing the mandate. So in this particular moment, Ukrainians were doing something which was really, really important, but was underestimated. But it is true that that particular revolution probably was not a revolution sensu stricto. It has made its way back to the legal to the legal path, and the third round of election was called. The Supreme Court ruled out the whole situation, and in the third round of election, in the beginning of January 2005, Yushchenko was elected Ukrainian president. But the dilemma before Yushchenko as a president was, first, Ukrainian society after this third round of election was very highly polarized. And second, he was on the verge to become president of Ukraine, but probably the last one, because all kind of predictions were circulating around that polarization is so strong that Ukraine is about to crack or about to collapse. That was a real threat, but it never happened. And what is also interesting that the next years fold out, and the opposition, the Yanukovych party, actually recaptured the power in the parliament already in 2006. And in the year 2010, Yanukovych was elected in a peaceful way, and Yushchenko passed the presidential claimants to Yanukovych. What has happened later? When in 2004, during the Orange Revolution, the European aspiration on Ukrainian street, on Ukrainian Maidan, was only a pink dream. Actually, nobody was waiting for Ukraine in Europe, as we know now. And some Ukrainians were dreaming about it, and the others were just skeptical. They didn't believe that. And by the year 2013, the situation has developed quite tremendously and progressed into the possibility for Ukraine to become an associate member of European Union and to fulfill this old symbolical gesture of homecoming. Central European countries did it already 2004, and we can repeat this scenario 10 or 12 or 15 years later. So European agenda, European path was very much about fighting all structural problems, all structural weaknesses of Ukraine. And it also was a chance to comply with some higher standards of living, higher standards of human rights defense, higher standards of green politics, and so on and so forth. For the younger generation, especially, it was a great opportunity. And this great opportunity was recognized not only in the western part or central part of Ukraine, but as we know now, almost all over Ukraine.
Irina, we are at 8 minutes. I can give you one more, please.
Okay, so in my understanding, Zelensky is both product of this new sense of common identity of Ukrainians, but at the same time, we will look for him as an actor of this new sense of identity and the best possible representative. Here I will stop, and I hope that I will have a chance to roll on my argument a little bit further.
Thank you so much, Irina, for reminding us of the narratives Ukrainians did not buy, the narrative of Soviet nostalgia, the narrative of lack of democracy, and the European agenda being high on the influence of Ukrainian politics. And Zelensky is both a product and an agent of Ukrainian identity. Thank you so much. Professor Philpott, Dan, if I may give the word to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It is an honor to be on this panel on the Zelensky Effect by Professors Onuch and Hale. Professor Hale, I might add, is Henry, who was once my apartment mate in Cambridge, Massachusetts during graduate school days when both of us had far more hair. It is good to see both of these area expert scholars apply their deep expertise to an urgent moral issue, the war in Ukraine. That is indeed the perspective from which I look at the book and at the conflict, from that of a political philosopher who has thought about the conflict through the just war ethic, which has for centuries been the West's dominant framework for thinking about the justice of war, and which is firmly ensconced in international law, the curricula of the military academies and other venues. Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 22nd, 2022, violated the most foundational principle of the United Nations Charter, the political independence and territorial integrity of states, the crime that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan had committed. It also violates the most fundamental tenet of the principle of just cause in the just war ethic, which is self-defense. Still, this legal principle alone, while valid, does not say what the moral foundations of it are. It is often claimed that the key crime is an attack on human life. Now, Russia's attack on the lives of Ukrainians is unconscionably criminal, and the lives of all lost in the war are tragic. But the loss of life cannot alone account for the injustices of the attack or the justice of self-defense. If it were, Ukraine might well have been obliged to sue for peace. Nor can the value of democracy alone account for it. If that were so, then a benign conquest that would make a people more democratic would be just. Putin is anything but such a benign conqueror and invaded more plausibly because he was threatened by democracy. But even if it were otherwise, the invasion would still be unjust. But we need something other than democracy to tell us why. Indeed, what is at stake and what the Ukrainians are defending is what is better thought of as the principle of the common good or the common life of a people. Over time, a collection of people cooperate to govern themselves. They vote, debate, legislate, deliberate, and the like together. And this cooperation forms a bond that can be called civic friendship, a good that they share in common. If they share a language and a common history, and if they combine these qualities with the desire for governance, they become a nation. We see the good of a nation in Zelensky's appeal to Ukrainians, including from the East, as is described so well in the book, which makes civic nationalism a key theme. Ukraine emerged as a nation in the late 18th and early 19th century, when a people with a common language developed a consciousness of itself, a common history, a common literature, and, over the course of this period, a desire to govern itself politically. It enjoyed independence only for a short time after the collapse of the Habsburg Empire in 1917, up until 1922, when it was absorbed by the Soviet Union, perhaps ironically, exactly 100 years before the attack of Russia upon Ukraine. In 1991, Ukrainian nationalism was alive and well when the Soviet Union collapsed, and Ukraine emerged as independent through a referendum that passed by 92% of the vote. A natural question arises: if the common good of a nation is the ethical core of my argument, then does it not also sanction the self-determination drives of the 4 eastern provinces and Crimea? In other writings, I have defended the principle of self-determination for a national people who does not enjoy independence on prima facie grounds. I also argued, though, that a national people who belongs to one state and seeks to join another must choose self-determination in a supermajority referendum and must respect the full human rights and citizenship of minorities in its own midst. Never ought a people to be seized and annexed in lieu of a peaceful and popular transfer of governance. This amounts to the crime of aggression, and this defeats many, if not most, self-determination movements. In the case of Eastern Ukrainian regions, their people have conducted no genuine referendums. Polls show that majorities are not in favor of joining Russia, and Putin's invasion has not been welcome even among most Russian speakers. That Putin staged sham referendums there in late September 2022 only testifies to his inability to secure genuine popular consensus for such a shift. The Zelensky Effect confirms this argument very powerfully, pointing out that Zelensky himself is a Russian speaker from the central eastern portions of Ukraine. True, in the Crimea, strong majorities are determined by reliable German polls, have favored Russia's annexation of March 2014. Still, the annexation took place through a conquest, also an act of aggression, and was judged as such by the vast majority of the international community of states. The common good of a nation also helps to address a couple of other rationales of Putin and of Patriarch Kirill. One is that in their speeches, they essentially do not describe Ukraine as a bona fide nation with a claim to independence. Ukraine is a problem internal to Russia. But the bona fide common bond of Ukrainians around a national identity, one manifested and solidified in the war itself, establishes Ukraine's claim to self-determination. The same ethic also helps address the question of NATO, which Putin cites as a reason for war. I think the importance of NATO is often exaggerated, for it has not been a consistent concern of Putin's over the past 20 years and has not inhibited friendship with the US during at least part of this time. Even still, NATO has never been anything but a defensive alliance in its 74 years of history. Ukraine's desires to align with NATO, or the EU for that matter, are only a threat to Putin's Russia if Putin does not regard Ukraine as an independent nation in the first place. But that is exactly what is at issue. Civic nationalism, an important theme in this book, is the key, I believe, to unlocking the question of justice.
Thank you so much, Dan, Professor Philpott. Civic nationalism as the key to justice, which was violated by the invasion, both in terms of international law and in terms of just war theory. Thank you to our three wonderful panelists. We have, before we move into the Q&A, we have a first respondent, Zoriana Rybczynska from Ukrainian Catholic University. Zoriana, if I may give the floor to you for a brief statement.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I'm glad to join this interesting conversation and to offer a somewhat different view of the character of Zelensky. The story of Ukrainian president is really impressive. If you want to know something about it, just look at Wikipedia. Here it's written about his life, career as a comedian, producer, actor, appearance in the political arena. Before the first round of 2019 presidential election, many Ukrainians watched the TV show Servant of the People with his participation. Analysts claim that this show's popularity contributed to Zelensky's election victory. Many of them are also convinced that Ukrainians actually voted for his character, an ordinary teacher who became the president and embodied the public demand for justice. In this way, the plot of mass culture became a political plot. The boundaries between the imaginary and the real were blurred again. It's reminiscent of Theodor Adorno's nightmare. The mass entertainment industry, which the philosopher criticized in the post-war world, turns into the entertainment industry of politics, with its producers, scriptwriters, and audiences invited to play the electorate. Today's mass culture actually uses the social imagination, uses the matrix of the monomyths about the hero's path in its narratives, plays with transitions between the virtual and the real. One example of a seemingly entertaining interpretation of this is the frivolous fun 2021 movie Free Guy. A few words about the plot. A bank teller discovers he is actually a background player in an open world video game and decides to become the hero of his own story. Now, in a world where there are no limits, he is determined to be the guy who saves his way before it's too late. I think you guessed that he manages not only to save the world, but also to make it better, fair, peaceful, open to all. So the world needs a hero and it gets one, say the authors of this movie. A similar transformation happened with the character of Zelensky in the political arena. With the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he took a position aimed at protecting the country's sovereignty. According to the assessment of numerous world media, Zelensky has accepted a role that almost no one expected from him. The character of Ryan Reynolds from the mentioned movie turns from a background player into a hero thanks to a unique code based on the ability of artificial intelligence to self-awareness and development. Instead, Zelensky turns into the embodiment of courage and bravery of a country that is fighting for freedom and independence. I really like the opinion of the authors of the book, The Zelensky Effect. He succeeds not because he is an extraordinary hero, but because he is an ordinary Ukrainian. His strength lies in his mediocrity, as the strength of Ukraine lies in ordinary people who become heroes and authors of their history. They change themselves and change the world around them. And here is a fundamental difference with the story told by Hollywood. The people of Ukraine, similar to the hero with 1,000 faces of Joseph Campbell, today pass the next stage of the hero's journey after the belly of the whale, apparent death. After that, he acquires the skills and knowledge of how to overcome his past, how to defeat the dragon, and return renewed to the renewed world. I hope that we can see more clearly the specific features of these people and find a code that writes itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Soriana. Thank you so much for navigating the space between mass entertainment and politics, between the world needs a hero and he's an ordinary Ukrainian. You even mentioned mediocrity as one of the properties. We have a few questions that I would like to ask you. Before we do that, any comment from Henry or Irina or Dan about anything you have heard? Any comment? Maybe Henry, we start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's been a very interesting discussion. I guess I would say I don't disagree with much of Professor Rybczynska's interpretation. I think that certainly he used his position in media to great effect politically. I think the main, including his television show, which we write in the book, we suspect this could have been, aimed at eventually running for the presidency at some point. And in fact, he had been recruited to enter high electoral politics much earlier. Even in 2014, Petro Poroshenko invited him to be a top candidate on his party list. And so he said no at that time. So the idea of high political aspirations, certainly was not something foreign to him at that time. I think where, we may have a different interpretation would just be in that, Olga and I see a lot of continuity, see more continuity than change in Zelensky over time, both in terms of his message that you can find, very, quite stable, at least since 2014, straight through what he's saying during the war, and his style, mobilizing social media, his communication style, which, again, was part of his campaign, but also part of what has made him very effective as a communicator, which I think is, of course, his maybe special skill, to the extent that, he's ordinary in many ways as an ordinary Ukrainian, but his skill as a communicator is certainly pretty extraordinary. The one change that we definitely talk about in the book, which is quite dramatic, was the one part of his message that was there in the presidential campaign, and that he changed very dramatically upon becoming president was, during the campaign, he talked about the need to just sit down and talk with Putin, and that we can just find a way to stop the killing. Just all we need to do is really talk and be reasonable. And already before the first half year of his presidency, the first year anyway, for sure, it seems pretty clear that he had realized that was, very naive. And at that point, you can see a lot of action.
Thank you, Henry. Can I stop you here? Then I will ask the first question to Irina, and then you can say what you want as well. Irina, the question is this. Ukrainian politics have revolved around parties formed by prominent personalities rather than policy positions. The Voice Party is led by Vakarchuk, a rock star. The Punch Party is led by Vitaly Klitschko, a former boxer. Zelensky, servant of the People Party, is named for a TV show. What does this say, if anything, about the place of politics in Ukraine? Given Zelensky's successes, how do we think the political landscape of Ukraine will be changed in the years to come? Any wisdom, Irina?
Yeah, I think that we have dramatically surpassed this phase of Ukrainian politics when big names were decisive or big legends were decisive for the election results. Why? Because I think we have the clue, the key to that already in the book. The Zelensky Effect book proposed that the effect of Zelensky is that there are 40 million Zelenskys in Ukraine. So actually, what is important, I want to somehow make a stress, which I haven't managed to do in my initial speech, that Zelensky, as president elected in 2019, represented those part of Ukrainians which were not aware of any existential threat to their own country. Those other people who were more mobilized and more hysteric, let's say, they have voted for Poroshenko, and they made 23%, if I'm not mistaken, and 72 were fairly well, they were okay with status quo. They only wanted this small accident happening on the eastern border of the country just to come to some halt. But it's interesting, the transformation of Zelensky was also transformation of these 72%. And they all together came this great road, be it the hero with 1,000 faces or just with one, but it was really a deep transformation. And here I also will address this very important and acute diagnosis that Professor Hale and Professor Onuch are doing, that the big tent Ukrainian civic identity has been born. And this big tent Ukrainian civic identity is not from the air. It has some historical prerequisites. Mikhailo Hrushevsky and Mikhailo Dragomanov, they were opting for this kind of civic identity for future Ukraine. That was Ukrainian People's Republic, and that was Ukrainian freedom, which will be freedom for all minorities, for all religions, for all languages and cultures within this land. But we know that history was not on Ukrainian side back in 1917, but feels like Ukraine, that history will be on Ukrainian side circa 2023, 2024. And my last point would be this. Many societies of today around the world would love to have such a leader as Zelensky in an hour of doom. But many leaders around the globe would love to lead such a society as Ukrainian society currently is.
Thank you, Irina. That was deep and thought-provoking. So you think the era of the big names are over in Ukraine, and we are moving in more, less spectacular times with politics. That's what I took away from your first statement. I have a question for Professor Philpott, if I may. The question is this. It's about elections. In normal times, Zelensky's first term as president of Ukraine would end in 2024. Do we anticipate a wartime election, and would such an enterprise weaken Zelensky's efforts to secure additional Western funding? What's your take on that, Ben?
A wartime election. Well, I don't know enough to know if elections are regularly scheduled. If they are, I hope very much that he would go through with it, and also that if the war, if and when the war does come to an end, that Zelensky would not kind of hold on to emergency powers as it will. I mean, any number of wars that have been carried on and come to an end with changes in leadership. I mean, one thinks of Churchill losing an election just before the end of World War II, and they were able to carry through on that one. And that I think that the democratic process is important enough that I think that and not like to see it suspended.
Since you mentioned Churchill, I have a question probably for Henry, but Irina and Soriana can chime in as well. There's sometimes the comparison between Churchill and Zelensky and Churchill. How valid is this comparison, Henry?
Well, I mean, I think as far as a leader who really kind of shows themselves in war, right, to be a symbolic leader that is able to rally not just the nation, right, but also play a big role on the world stage, advocating for the cause. I do think it's a a good comparison in many ways. Of course, in many other ways, they're very, very different figures, right? Churchill is like the consummate insider politician, right? Whereas Zelensky's like very, very different in what he brings to the table. But I do think that but as Dan mentioned, this also speaks to the question you originally posed to Irina, which is about the future of Ukraine. It's just hard to tell now because wartime leaders are often not seen as the right person to lead post-war construction. Yeah. And so it remains to be seen whether people, will have that kind of faith in Zelensky, and it's very possible other figures could be adopted. I mean, there are many people who are demonstrating tremendous competence and leadership, and national loyalty, in Ukraine during the war effort who, might be also, viable candidates once democracy, once martial law is lifted and you can actually, have kind of a free and fair, kind of fully open election, which is very difficult in the wartime context, but is possible.
Thank you. So, Rihanna, may I ask you a personal question? Were you surprised by Volodymyr Zelensky's performance once the invasion had happened? Were you surprised by his leadership in the war?
I think,
Zoriana. Yes, Zoriana, please.
I think that Zelensky themselves may be a little bit surprised for themselves, yes, about changing his role in a political arena, but I think he liked it. It's very important part of his comedian career, and he liked to be a hero.
Okay, thank you, Zoriana. Irina, anything to add? Yes, please.
Yeah, just to pick up the thread about Zelensky as Churchill, my take on this question would be that Zelensky is such a prosaic, transformative figure that he was first Ukrainian Chamberlain, turned into Ukrainian Churchill, and who knows, he may well turn into Ukrainian Clement Attlee after the war.
Powerful. We need to write this down, Irina. Thank you. I have a question for Dan Philpott. Following the attacks in Gaza, President Zelensky has said Russia is interested in triggering a war in the Middle East so that a new source of pain and suffering could undermine world unity, increase discord and contradictions, and thus help Russia destroy freedom in Europe. End of quote. How do you see this conflict affecting the war in Ukraine, and how does this complicate Zelensky's efforts?
Well, yeah, I have no idea if I have no idea whether Russia was behind anyway connected with the attack. I mean, I hope people would see that the two conflicts are similar, and you have one of the most salient violations of international order that one can have, which is a direct violation, a direct attack, and a direct aggression against a people. And this was, of course, the crime that established the UN system, behind which political independence and territorial integrity are based. And as the UN system has evolved, we've seen, it's been criticized for not adapting to new different kinds of conflicts and so forth. But this is sort of the paradigmatic one. It's the one where when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and was it August 1990, that this is how world opinion galvanized in a unified way, because it was so salient and such a salient violation of these principles. So, I mean, my hope is that countries would see that we have a commitment to world order, and world order means defending this most fundamental norm. And I think that this is one of my deep concerns about those who are opposing funding for the Ukrainians and so forth, that if we don't defend world order, these principles in this situation, where are we going to defend them? And I think a failure to defend Ukraine at this point would result in very direct lessons in many other places that would be very, very, very negative.
Thank you, Dan. Henry, any take on the question how the Middle East conflict might affect the war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I guess the fear is that it will, distract countries, right, and distract leaders, and give opportunities to opponents, of supporting Ukraine to say, well, we need to support Israel instead of Ukraine. But again, I think as Dan really effectively points out, right, it's a false choice. We have to be supporting international order in these ways, and sovereignty, and opposing aggression across the board. And in the Ukrainian case, I think the consequences are just so massive. So the hope will be that it reinforces the argument that we have to stand up for territorial sovereignty of states and the need for them to defend themselves, because otherwise we're just going to be seeing more and more of this, right? Ukraine is kind of the first strike, and especially if Russia has an interest, among others, countries, in fomenting world order to try to, or disorder in order to distract us from opposing its aims, then this hopefully will be kind of a wake-up call that we really need to double down in support for defending Ukraine.
Thank you, Henry. A simple but loaded question for Irina. Is Zelensky doing the right thing against corruption? How big a problem is corruption for Zelensky's leadership?
My understanding is that Ukrainian corruption, which was very well exposed and very well investigated, both inside Ukraine and out from the outside of Ukraine, was the case which was broadly discussed around the world. But there was a bigger corruption in Russian Federation, which was not discussed almost at all. Mm-hmm. And in my understanding, Ukraine in 2000s and 2010s was a transit country, not only for Russian gas and oil, but also for Russian corruption. So we don't know. It's not a fair play. When the Russian Federation ceased to interfere with Ukrainian internal politics and external politics, we will see what will happen. And I hope that we are all entering some moment of clarity, which will go with us. And I'm also thinking here about Hans Jonas and his very important book, Imperative of Responsibility. Mm-hmm. Jonas has been writing circa 1979, the prophecy of doom is to be given greater heed than the prophecy of bliss. And I think that European countries, Western European, Central European countries, we're giving heed to the prophecy of bliss instead of the prophecy of doom. And now it's vice versa. This is the Zeitenwende Chancellor Scholz was actually talking about.
That's very deep. Thank you. And Hans Jonas talking about the hermeneutics of fear and the importance of being suspicious, especially given the nuclear armament that he was worried about in the 70s, so many years before where we are now, and it's in a much more fragile situation, the world. Yeah. True. A quick question for any of you. What could world leaders learn from Volodymyr Zelensky? Any take for this question? What could world leaders learn from Volodymyr Zelensky? Anyone? Beautiful, simple question. Henry.
I mean, again, there's a lot that one could say, but just in line with one of the themes of this discussion, I think would be, the importance of advancing narratives of national unity as opposed to division within nations, because lots of politicians, exploit divisions within their country in order to come to power. Hyper partisanship, or whether it's identity related politics, and that can complicate things for countries generally. And I think one thing that Zelensky has shown is that the power of kind of having a long association with a narrative of national unity has helped make his leadership model work. And and it's also something that clearly just gives the lie, just exposes the falsehood of Putin's narratives that as Irina mentioned, that that Ukraine is a divided country, because he's exactly the kind of person who, according to Putin, if Putin's worldview were correct, should be welcoming Russia. but obviously, it's something very different. And so that might be one thing that I would highlight.
Great.
Just off the top.
Something for the United States of America to learn, if I may say so, in a little footnote. Yeah. Anything else world leaders could learn from President Zelensky? Maybe Dan?
Yeah, I thought much the same thing, that if you look at his ability to unify Ukrainians around a common national identity, and several of the other speakers mentioned about how it looked like there were divisions. People said in the eastern provinces that there were large populations ready to welcome Russia, and that you had divisions between the religions and the western portion versus eastern portion. But I think Zelensky has done a very effective job in unifying Ukrainians around the nation, around this national identity, one which they forged and defended and held on to during the whole Soviet period, and then have celebrated since 91, 92. And this is also, by the way, exactly the thing that Putin wants to deny. I mean, you could talk about the different causes why Putin invaded and so forth. And I think one of the underlying factors was his framing of Ukraine as not really being an independent nation, that this is a set of folkways, or something that some people talk about or whatever, but it's really part of the Russian sphere. And if you look at the rhetoric in which he's defended it, he doesn't talk about, this is another nation that we're going to war with. And Kirill has backed him up totally on this, Patriarch Kirill, of seeing this as just kind of a component people of the Russian sphere. And I think that framing and that identity, which denies that nationhood, has been very important.
Thank you.
Excuse me. Yeah, very important.
Thank you, Dan. Our plane is landing slowly. Maybe a very short last question for Irina. Would Zelensky effect be possible without social media?
Well, it's the question for alternative reality. I just can't imagine how everything will unfold with no social media. But in the same time, I think that every previous big leader had some kind of media. What was it? Radio? Was it TV? Something right like that. But coming back to your initial question about what other leaders around the world can learn from Zelensky, I think they can learn that to be a joker in politics could be of some important use, that the human faith and human heart is back to politics, and it's very effective, and that old pragmatism actually bow to the new idealism. And this is the current we have to face and to think about it very seriously.
Beautiful. Thank you. We are at time. There's one question. I will leave you with the question. No answers. We will go away with the question. It is, I'm confused. Is Zelensky an ordinary man or an extraordinary man, or an ordinary man in extraordinary circumstances? Question mark. Thank you. We want to thank our panelists and our first respondent. Thank you, Henry, Irina, Dan, and Soriana. We want to thank all of the audience for your interest and your questions. We want to thank our colleagues who made this panel possible, especially Tim Jackley, Grant Osborne, Keith Sayer, and Becca Prince. I will end with this. On the day of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, our university president, Father Jenkins, has issued a statement where he said, "Our friends in Ukraine are in need of healing and hope. We at Notre Dame stand in solidarity with all peace-loving people worldwide in demanding an end to this invasion of a sovereign nation. This unprovoked war is an international abomination and must stop now. Until it does, may God keep safe all of the innocent men, women, and children who are currently in harm's way. The prayers of the Notre Dame family are with them." With these prayers for peace for Ukraine and for the world in the Middle East, we from the Nanovic Institute for European Studies want to wish you all a good and safe afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a good day. Thank you.